October 7, 1944, Camp Florence, Arizona. The desert sun beat down mercilessly as a transport truck rolled through the gates of the prisoner of war facility, carrying its unusual cargo. 42 German women, members of the Luftwaffe Women's Auxiliary Corps, stepped onto American soil for the first time as prisoners. They had been captured in France during the Allied advance, serving as radio operators, clerks, and communication specialists for the retreating Wehrmacht. Their gray uniforms were stained and worn, their faces gaunt from months of diminishing rations even before their capture. Among them was 24-year-old Greta Hoffmann from Berlin, a former telegraph operator who hadn't seen her family in over 2 years. Beside her stood Margaret Klein, 19, from Munich, her hands still trembling from the long journey across the Atlantic. They had been prepared for harsh treatment, for the cruelty they had been told to expect from American captors. What they were not prepared for was what happened in the camp mess hall that first evening. Corporal James Mitchell, a farm boy from Iowa, assigned to oversee the initial processing, had arranged for a simple welcome meal. Nothing elaborate, just standard camp fare. But when the German women filed into the dining hall and saw what awaited them on the metal trays, something unexpected happened. Several of them stopped walking entirely, causing a confused backup in the line. Others gasped audibly, their eyes widening in disbelief. On each tray sat a thick slice of fresh white bread, its crust golden brown, its interior soft and pale. Beside it, a pat of real butter, a serving of beef stew with visible chunks of meat, potatoes, carrots, and a small square of chocolate for dessert. Greta reached the front of the line and accepted her tray with shaking hands. She stared at the bread as if it were a mirage, something that might vanish if she looked away. The American serving the food noticed her frozen expression and assumed she didn't understand. "Bread," he said slowly, pointing. "Fresh white bread, baked this morning." Greta understood English well enough, but understanding the words and believing what she was seeing were two entirely different things. She had not seen bread this white, this soft, this abundant since 1942. Even officers in the Luftwaffe had been eating dense, dark loaves mixed with sawdust and potato flour by the time she was captured. Margaret, standing behind Greta, whispered in German, "Das kann nicht echt sein." This cannot be real. But it was real. When Greta finally moved to a table and sat down with the other women, none of them ate immediately. They simply stared at their trays, at the impossible abundance before them. Some touched the bread carefully, pressing fingers into its softness to confirm it was genuine. Others looked around suspiciously, as if this might be some elaborate trick, a test of their loyalty or a cruel joke before the real deprivation began. Ilse Werner, a 30-year-old administrative clerk from Hamburg, was the first to cry. She picked up the slice of bread, held it to her face, and inhaled deeply before tears began streaming down her cheeks. Greta Hoffmann's hands trembled as she held that first slice of American bread, and her mind involuntarily traveled back to the winter of 1943 in Berlin. She had been working at the Tempelhof Communication Center then, managing encrypted messages for Luftwaffe operations across the Eastern Front. The work was demanding, the hours brutal, but what she remembered most vividly was the hunger that gnawed at her constantly, a companion that never left her side. Her daily ration had been reduced to 200 grams of bread, and even that meager portion was barely recognizable as bread. The loaf was dense, dark gray, and bitter, stretched with sawdust, chestnuts, and whatever else the bakers could find to make the dwindling flour supplies last longer. She remembered breaking a tooth on a small stone that had been ground into the flour, remembered the way the bread sat heavy in her stomach like clay, providing bulk but little actual nourishment. Margaret's memory pulled her back even further to the last real bread she had eaten in Munich in 1942. She had been 17 then, working at a munitions factory before being recruited into the Auxiliary Corps. Her mother had somehow managed to save enough flour ration stamps to bake a small white loaf for Margaret's birthday. The entire family, her parents and 3 younger siblings, had gathered around their kitchen table and each received one thin slice. They had eaten it slowly, reverently, knowing it might be months or even years before they tasted anything like it again. Her youngest brother, Klaus, who was only 8, had cried because his slice was gone too quickly. That loaf had required 2 months of saved rations, and her mother had looked 10 years older from the stress of deciding whether to spend those precious stamps on one moment of normalcy or stretch them across weeks of survival. By the time Margaret joined the Auxiliary Corps in 1943, real bread had become a distant memory. The military rations were supposedly better than civilian allotments, but even soldiers were eating bread that was more sawdust than wheat. She had learned to chew slowly, to make each bite last, to drink water with every mouthful to help it go down. She had learned to ignore the splinters on her tongue from the wood pulp, to pretend the bitter aftertaste was normal. She had watched women around her grow thinner despite eating their full rations, their bodies unable to extract real nutrition from the substitute bread that filled their stomachs but provided little sustenance. Ilse Werner's tears came from an even deeper place of deprivation. As an administrative clerk in Hamburg, she had been responsible for managing supply records for her unit. She had watched the numbers decline month by month, had typed reports documenting the steady reduction in food quality and quantity. She knew exactly how desperate Germany's situation had become because she had filed the paperwork proving it. By the summer of 1944, just months before her capture, the bread ration in Hamburg had been reduced to 150 grams per day, and the composition was barely 15% actual grain. The rest was potato flour, pea flour, corn cobs ground into powder, and cellulose fiber extracted from wood. She had typed a memo that described the bread as nutritionally equivalent to eating cardboard, and her commanding officer had ordered her to destroy it rather than let it be filed officially. Now, sitting in an American prison camp, these women held bread that was not just white but soft, not just edible but actually pleasant. The contrast was so stark, so impossible to reconcile with everything they knew about the world, that their minds struggled to process it. The German women ate their first American meal in complete silence, but it was not the silence of gratitude or satisfaction. It was the silence of profound cognitive dissonance, of minds trying to reconcile impossible contradictions. They had been told for years that America was suffering, that the British blockade had been turned against the Allies themselves, that the American people were starving while their government poured resources into a war across the ocean. The propaganda had been specific and consistent. American civilians were rioting over food shortages, their soldiers were undernourished and weak, their industrial capacity was collapsing under the weight of rationing and scarcity. Yet here sat Greta, finishing her second slice of bread because the American corporal had walked by and simply placed another piece on her tray without comment, as if bread were so abundant that seconds required no justification or special permission. Here sat Margaret, staring at the pat of butter she had been too overwhelmed to use, real butter made from cream, not the gray margarine substitute she had grown accustomed to in Germany. And here sat Ilse, who had carefully wrapped her chocolate square in a napkin to save for later, unable to quite believe that something so precious would not be demanded back. The next morning brought even more confusion. Breakfast consisted of oatmeal with milk, fried eggs, bacon, toast with jam, and coffee with real sugar. Not ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns or chicory, but actual coffee that smelled rich and dark and real. The German women sat at their tables looking at portions that would have fed an entire family back home for days. Some of them could not finish their meals, their stomachs having shrunk from years of inadequate nutrition, their bodies no longer capable of processing such abundance. Greta watched as American guards ate their own breakfasts at a nearby table, laughing at us, talking casually, leaving food on their plates that they simply scraped into waste bins. She watched a young private throw away half a piece of toast because he said he was too full. The casual wastefulness was more shocking than the abundance itself. In Germany, leaving food on your plate was nearly a criminal act, a betrayal of the collective sacrifice. Here it seemed there was so much food that waste was not just possible, but common. By the third day, the women began to whisper among themselves during meals, trying to understand what they were experiencing. Margaret voiced what many were thinking. If this is how they feed prisoners, how do their own people eat? Ilse, with her administrative background, was already doing calculations in her head. The amount of food provided to 42 enemy prisoners in 3 days would have required thousands of ration stamps in Germany, months of saved allotments, connections to black market suppliers. Yet here it appeared without effort, without apology. as if feeding people properly was simply normal. The bread especially haunted them. Fresh loaves appeared at every meal, white and soft and endless. The Americans called it ordinary. The Germans clutched it like gold. Private Daniel Cooper had grown up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin, where his mother had taught him that food was the language of hospitality. He had watched the German women during their first week at Camp Florence with growing concern. They ate mechanically, their faces masks of suspicion and confusion. But what troubled him most was what happened after meals. He noticed them hiding bread in their pockets, wrapping slices in napkins, and tucking them into their uniforms. At first he thought they were planning something, perhaps hoarding supplies for an escape attempt. He reported it to his commanding officer, Captain Robert Hayes, who simply shook his head with unexpected compassion. "They're not planning anything, Cooper," the captain explained. "They're starving. Not now, but in their minds they're still starving. When you've gone hungry long enough, you can't trust that the next meal will come. Let them keep the bread." But Private Cooper couldn't quite let it go. He began paying attention to which women hoarded the most, and he noticed patterns. Greta Hoffman always took extra bread but never ate it immediately. Margaret Klein wrapped her portion so carefully as if they were precious artifacts. One afternoon, Cooper approached the table where several German women sat during their afternoon break. He carried a basket covered with a kitchen towel. The women looked up warily, uncertain what this meant. "I thought you might like to try something," Cooper said, his voice gentle. He pulled back the towel to reveal fresh cinnamon rolls, still warm from the oven, their frosting melting slightly in the Arizona heat. The women stared at him as if he had produced diamonds from thin air. Greta was the first to speak, her English halting, but clear. "Why do you give us this? We are prisoners. We are your enemy." Cooper set the basket on the table and sat down across from them. "My mother always said that anyone sitting at your table isn't your enemy. They're your guest, even if it's a table neither of you chose." Margaret reached slowly for one of the rolls, still expecting him to snatch it away, to reveal this as some sort of test or trick. But Cooper simply smiled and pushed the basket closer. "Go ahead. Cook made extra. Said they'd just go to waste otherwise." The word waste struck them again, that casual American assumption that food could be extra, that abundance was normal. Ilsa took a roll and bit into it carefully. The sweetness of the cinnamon and sugar was almost overwhelming after years of bitter ersatz foods. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she was transported back to her childhood in Hamburg, to Sunday mornings when her grandmother would bake. "Your mother?" Greta said carefully, looking at Cooper. "She taught you to bake?" Cooper laughed. "She tried. I'm terrible at it, but she taught me why it matters. Food isn't just about filling stomachs. It's about showing people they matter, that they're not forgotten." Something shifted in that moment around the table. The women began to ask Cooper questions about his home, his family, his life before the war. He answered honestly, without propaganda or pretense. Greta Hoffman kept a small cloth bag hidden beneath her cot mattress. Inside were 17 slices of bread in various stages of staleness, carefully wrapped in napkins she had taken from the mess hall. Every night, she would check on them before sleeping, counting them like a miser counting coins. She knew it was irrational, knew that fresh bread would appear again at breakfast, but her hands moved automatically to add each day's saved portion to her collection. The bread was becoming hard now, some pieces developing spots of mold that she carefully cut away. She could not bring herself to throw any of it out. Private Cooper noticed her obsession and mentioned it to Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, one of the few female staff members at the camp. Sergeant Gonzalez understood in a way the male soldiers could not. Her own grandmother had lived through famine in Mexico and had hoarded food until the day she died, decades after the hunger had passed. One afternoon, Gonzalez sat down beside Greta during recreation time in the camp yard. She did not mention the bread directly, but instead began telling Greta about her grandmother, about how trauma leaves marks that outlast the circumstances that created them. Margaret Klein's hoarding took a different form. She did not keep the bread for herself, but was saving every crust, every piece she could spare, meticulously wrapping them and marking each package with dates written in pencil on the napkins. When Sergeant Gonzalez gently asked her why, Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "My sister," she whispered in broken English. "Anna. She is 12 years old, maybe still in Munich, maybe still alive. She clutched the wrapped bread packages. "I think when I go home, I bring her this. I show her that I did not forget her, that I saved food for her even when I was far away." The logic was childlike, impossible. The bread would rot long before any repatriation occurred, and even if it did not, bringing stale American bread to Germany would accomplish nothing. But Sergeant Gonzalez understood that Margaret was not really saving bread. She was saving hope, maintaining the belief that her sister was alive, that there would be a reunion, that her sacrifice of present comfort for future provision would somehow matter. To tell her the truth would be to take away the only thing that gave her actions meaning. Ilse Werner approached food differently than the others. She did not hoard bread, but she also could not stop crying when she ate it. Every meal brought fresh tears that she tried to hide, turning away from the other women, wiping her eyes quickly with her sleeve. Finally, Greta asked her directly what was wrong. Ilse's answer was simple and devastating. "I am thinking of all the people in Hamburg who are eating sawdust bread right now. My neighbors, my friends, children I knew. I am eating this beautiful food, and they are starving. What right do I have to this abundance while they suffer?" It was the question that haunted all of them, the guilt that came with every satisfying meal. Dr. Eleanor Harrison, the camp's medical officer, had been monitoring the German women's health since their arrival. What concerned her was not malnutrition, which was improving rapidly with proper feeding, but something more psychological. The women were gaining weight appropriately, their vitamin deficiencies were resolving, yet they exhibited behaviors consistent with starvation trauma. They ate rapidly, defensively, barely chewing. They became anxious if meals were delayed even slightly. And most tellingly, they could not stop hoarding food, despite repeated assurances that more would always be provided. Dr. Harrison decided to try an experiment. She arranged for the camp kitchen to be opened for tours, allowing the German prisoners to see exactly where their food came from and how much was available. On a warm October morning, she led a group of 12 women, including Greta, Margaret, and Ilse, into the massive storage facility behind the kitchen. What they saw stopped them in their tracks. Rows upon rows of shelves stretched back into the dimness, stacked with canned goods, sacks of flour, boxes of pasta, and containers of every imaginable ingredient. One entire wall was dedicated to bread flour alone, 50-pound bags stacked from floor to ceiling. The camp baker, a cheerful man named Sergeant James Wu, greeted them warmly. "Welcome, ladies," he said through an interpreter. "I understand you have concerns about the bread supply." He gestured broadly at the storage room. "This is what we have on hand right now. We receive supply trucks twice a week from Phoenix. We never run out." Greta stepped forward, her engineer's mind trying to calculate the quantities she was seeing. "How many people does this feed?" she asked in careful English. Sergeant Wu consulted a clipboard. "This camp has approximately 300 personnel total, including guards, staff, and prisoners. This current inventory could feed us for roughly 6 weeks, but like I said, we get fresh supplies twice weekly. We never let it get below a month's worth." 6 weeks of food, sitting in storage, treated as a normal operational reserve. Margaret felt dizzy trying to comprehend it. In Germany, such quantities would require armed guards, rationing bureaucracy, and distribution systems involving thousands of officials. Here it was managed by one sergeant with a clipboard in a facility that was not even locked. Ilse walked slowly along the shelves, running her fingers along the bags of flour. "In Hamburg," she said quietly, "the flour ration for the entire city was sometimes only enough for 3 days. And it was not flour like this, it was mixed with sawdust and chemicals." Sergeant Wu looked genuinely shocked. "I had no idea it was that bad over there," he admitted. "I mean, we knew there were shortages, but I figured your military was still eating okay." "No one was eating okay," Ilse replied. "Not for years." That evening, Greta finally threw away her hidden bag of moldy bread. It was a small act, but it represented something larger, the beginning of belief that tomorrow would not bring renewed scarcity, that the abundance was real and would continue. Trust, she was learning, was harder to restore than health. The International Red Cross permitted prisoners of war to send limited correspondence home, carefully censored to prevent transmission of military intelligence. In early November of 1944, the German women at Camp Florence were given paper, envelopes, and permission to write to their families. Greta sat at a table in the recreation hall, pen in hand, staring at the blank page before her. She wanted to tell her mother about the bread, about the abundance, about how American prisoners ate better than German officers. But how could she possibly explain what she was experiencing without sounding like she had lost her mind or, worse, been seduced by enemy propaganda? She began writing carefully, knowing a censor would read every word. "Dear Mother, I am healthy and being treated well. The food here is adequate." Adequate. The word felt like a betrayal of truth, but what else could she say? "I am fed fresh bread daily" would sound like delusional fantasy to anyone in Berlin. Her mother would think the letter was a fake, an American propaganda trick. She continued, "I hope you and Father are managing with the rations. I think of you constantly and pray you are getting enough to eat." She stopped, reading back what she had written, the POW. Disconnect between her reality and theirs was so vast that honest communication had become impossible. Margaret struggled with a different problem. She wanted to write to her sister Anna to tell her that she was saving bread for her, that she had not forgotten her. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how cruel such a letter would be. What comfort would it bring Anna to know that her sister was eating abundantly while she starved? Would it not just deepen the unfairness, the bitter knowledge that geography and circumstance had placed them on opposite sides of an absurd divide? She finally wrote, "Dear Anna, I miss you every day. I am healthy and hope you are too. Please tell Mother I am thinking of her always. I will come home as soon as I am able." She did not mention food at all. Ilse took a different approach. She decided to tell the truth, consequences be damned. "Dear Hedwig," she wrote to her best friend in Hamburg, "you will not believe what I am about to tell you, but I swear on everything I hold sacred that it is true. The Americans feed us 3 full meals every day. Real food, Hedwig. Fresh white bread at every meal, not once a week or once a month, but every single day. Butter, real butter, from cream, meat, vegetables, fruit, and coffee with actual sugar." She continued for 2 full pages, describing in detail every meal, every abundance, every casual waste she had witnessed. She wrote knowing the letter would likely never reach Hedwig, that the censors would probably destroy it as obvious fiction or enemy propaganda. But she needed to write it anyway, needed to document the truth, even if no one would ever read it. When Captain Hayes reviewed the letters before sending them, he held Ilse's in his hand for a long moment. Then, against regulations, he sealed it and added it to the outgoing mail. December brought cooler weather to the Arizona desert and an unexpected proposal from Sergeant Wu. He had been thinking about the German women's relationship with bread, about how it represented something deeper than simple nutrition. He approached Captain Hayes with an idea that was either brilliant or completely inappropriate, depending on how one looked at it. "Sir, I'd like to teach some of the prisoners to bake. Real American-style bread. I think it might help them adjust." Captain Hayes was skeptical. "You want to train enemy prisoners in our kitchen, with access to knives, ovens, and supplies?" But Sergeant Wu persisted. "Sir, these women aren't dangerous. They're traumatized. And I think learning to create abundance instead of just consuming it might change something for them." After a week of consideration and consultation with higher command, permission was granted. 6 German women, including Greta and Margaret, were selected for the first baking class. On a cool December morning, they entered the camp kitchen not as prisoners being fed, but as students learning a craft. Sergeant Wu had prepared everything in advance: flour, yeast, salt, sugar, butter, and warm water. He began demonstrating the process, his hands working the dough with practiced efficiency. "Bread is about patience and trust," he explained through the interpreter. "You have to trust that the yeast will rise, that the dough will double if you give it time and warmth. You cannot rush it or force it." Greta watched intently, her mind already understanding the chemistry and physics of what was happening. The yeast consuming sugars, producing carbon dioxide, creating structure through gluten development. But her hands, when she began kneading her own portion of dough, told a different story. She pressed too hard, worked too quickly, trying to force the process to move faster. Sergeant Wu gently corrected her. "Easy. You are not fighting it. You are working with it. Feel how it changes under your hands." Margaret found herself crying again as she kneaded her dough. the rhythmic motion, the warmth of the mixture, the yeasty smell, all of it transported her back to childhood memories of her grandmother's kitchen in Munich. Before the war, before the hunger, before everything fell apart. "My Oma taught me to bake when I was 7, she said quietly. I had forgotten what it felt like. The first loaves emerged from the oven, golden and perfect, their crusts crackling, steam rising from their soft interiors. The 6 women stood around the cooling racks, staring at what they had created. This was not bread that had been given to them, not charity or evidence of American abundance. This was bread they had made with their own hands, using skills they could take with them wherever they went. Sergeant Wu cut thick slices and passed them around, still warm. "Now you know the secret," he said with a smile. "Bread is not magic. It is just flour, water, time, and care. Anyone can make it if they have the ingredients and the knowledge." Greta bit into her slice and tasted something beyond bread. She tasted possibility. Spring of 1945 brought news that the war in Europe was teaching the women to make bread. He was teaching them a skill they could use anywhere, a trade that could sustain them whether they returned to Germany or somehow found a way to stay. Greta kneaded dough with increasing confidence. Each loaf she produced a small act of defiance against the scarcity that had defined her world for so long. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war was over and the time for decisions had come. Captain Hayes called the German women together one final time before repatriation procedures began. He stood before them with unexpected emotion in his voice, these women who had arrived as enemies and become something he had never anticipated. "You have a choice to make," he told them. "Some of you have expressed interest in remaining in the United States. I have been authorized to tell you that applications for refugee status will be considered on an individual basis. It is not guaranteed, but it is possible." Of the 42 women who had arrived at Camp Florence 7 months earlier, 14 requested permission to stay. Greta was among them. She had received word through the Red Cross that her parents had died in the final bombing of Berlin. She had no home to return to, no family waiting. But more than that, she had discovered something in America that she wanted to protect and build upon. She had learned that abundance was not a fantasy, but a choice, that societies could be structured around plenty instead of scarcity. Margaret chose differently. Despite having no confirmation of Anna's survival, despite the devastation awaiting her in Munich, she felt a pull stronger than logic. "Germany needs people who have seen how things can be different," she explained to Greta the night before the transports departed. "Someone has to go back and help rebuild, not just the buildings, but the way people think about each other, about resources, about what is possible." Ilse also chose to return, but for different reasons. She felt she owed Germany her presence in its darkest hour, that accepting American comfort while her countrymen suffered would be a betrayal she could not live with. Yet she packed carefully in her bag the recipes Sergeant Wu had written out for her, the techniques for making bread from basic ingredients. "I will teach others," she promised. "I will show them that hunger does not have to be permanent, that we can rebuild not just our cities, but our ability to feed ourselves with dignity." The women who stayed and those who returned maintained course was ending. Allied forces were closing in on Berlin, and German resistance was collapsing on all fronts. For the women at Camp Florence, victory meant repatriation, the long-anticipated return home. But as the reality of that return drew closer, many found themselves paralyzed by an impossible decision. Official word came in late April that arrangements were being made to transport all German prisoners back to Europe within 60 days. Captain Hayes called a general assembly to explain the process. The women would be transferred to processing centers in New York, then loaded onto ships bound for occupied Germany. They would be released to international Red Cross supervision and allowed to return to their home cities, assuming those cities still existed. Greta sat in the assembly hall listening to these plans and felt nothing resembling relief or joy. She thought about Berlin, about the reports of massive destruction, about her parents who she had not heard from in 8 months. She thought about the rubble, the chaos, the starvation that would be worse now than ever before. And she thought about the bag of moldy bread she had once hidden under her mattress, about how far she had come from that frightened, hoarding woman to someone who now knew how to create abundance with her own hands. Margaret's internal struggle was even more acute. She had been saving bread for Anna, maintaining the fantasy that she would return home bearing gifts. But recent Red Cross reports indicated that Munich had been heavily bombed. Her family's neighborhood had been hit in a raid in January. She had no confirmation that Anna was alive, that anyone from her family had survived. If she returned to Germany, she would be returning to grief, devastation, and quite possibly complete solitude. Yet how could she not return? How could she stay in comfort while her countrymen suffered? What kind of person chose safety over duty to their homeland? Ilse had been corresponding with a family in Phoenix, the Thompsons, who had visited the camp as part of a church outreach program. Mrs. Thompson had lost a son at Normandy, yet she had extended unexpected kindness to the German women, seeing in them not enemies, but fellow human beings caught in tragedy. She had quietly mentioned to Ilse that if she ever needed help settling in America after the war, the Thompson family would sponsor her. The offer had seemed theoretical then, impossible to seriously consider. Now it felt like a lifeline to a future that did not involve returning to a country that no longer existed in any recognizable form. The baking classes continued through April and May, but they took on new significance. Sergeant Wu was no longer just correspondence for decades. Margaret wrote to Greta about finding Anna alive in a displaced persons camp, about the slow, painful reconstruction of Munich, about teaching children who had known only war what peace could look like. Ilse wrote about opening a small bakery in Hamburg, about using the skills she had learned in an American prison camp to feed her neighbors, about how fresh bread became a symbol of Germany's recovery. Greta became an American citizen in 1951. She married a fellow immigrant, opened her own bakery in Phoenix, and never forgot what a simple loaf of white bread had taught her about abundance, kindness, and the power of small mercies to transform enemies into family. Years later, when asked why she had chosen to stay, her answer was always the same. Because I learned that home is not where you suffer together, but where you build something better together. And fresh bread, real bread made with care, is where that building begins.